Howdy, everyone, and welcome to our workshop, Improve the User Experience of Your Android Application. I'm Pittman, a developer relations engineer here at Google.
I'm Nohe, also developer relations engineer at Google.
And today we're going to tell you how to improve the experience of your Android app by adding edge-to-edge design, predictive back animations, and a widget built using Jetpack Glance. And we're going to add all of these to the SociaLite application, one of our many code examples on GitHub. Ash, would you like to start with edge-to-edge?
Yes, I would. Thank you, Summers. Okay, so for our first code lab, we are going to handle edge-to-edge enforcements in Android 15. Our SociaLite app will start off looking like this, where it will not be edge-to-edge. The system bars, which are the status bar at the top and the navigation bar at the bottom, are opaque, and content draws between the bars. At the end of the code lab, SociaLite will look like this. It will be edge-to-edge, the bars will be transparent, and the app background will literally draw from one edge of the screen to the other. SociaLite will also be backwards compatible, and will fix a few issues along the way. We're making this change because an internal Google user study found that users significantly prefer edge-to-edge screens over non-edge-to-edge screens. And users feel these screens are more satisfying and premium. Okay, so let's jump into the code lab. So we have this pathway, improve the user experience of your Android app. You'll want to locate this pathway here. And then the edge-to-edge code lab is just the first one, which I have pulled up here. Before you begin, you are going to need, an Android 15 Beta 1 or higher test device and SDK. Then you're going to get the starter code, which you can get from this link here or by running these get commands. And then run SociaLite and investigate it, and then meet me in part 3. So I already have SociaLite downloaded and running on my app, on my device, and I can see that I am targeting SDK 34, or in other words, Android 14, and SociaLite is not edge-to-edge. You can see that the system bars are opaque at the top and the bottom, and that is the case for every screen. So let's go ahead and target Android 15 and see what happens. Okay, we're syncing and running. So since we're working with a preview, we've set target SDK preview to vanilla ice cream. If you're from the future, you're probably going to set this to target SDK 35. Let's see. I'm going to uninstall and reinstall. It's always a good first troubleshooting step. Nope. I'm going to switch to a different device, see if that works. All right, let me just run this app again, make sure it works. Okay, it does. So after we have enforced edge-to-edge by targeting Android 15, we see that SociaLite is now indeed edge-to-edge. And you might think that our work here is done, so the first code lab is over, but that's not the case. There's actually 2 issues we need to fix. And both of these issues are best seen in 3-button navigation mode. So I'm going to go to the Settings app here and change it to 3-button navigation and switch back. And then you can probably see the first issue best in dark mode. So let me switch to that. Okay. So now in dark mode, we see that there is this white band at the bottom with the 3-button system navigation. This is, in fact, a translucent band. So in Android 15, the defaults for gesture navigation and for the status bar at the top are to be transparent. But for 3-button navigation, it will be translucent. And this is to ensure accessibility. This is the first issue we're going to fix because in our app, it would actually look better if this band were removed and the 3-button here were just transparent instead. So that's the first issue we'll fix. The second issue is if we go to one of the conversation screens, say dog conversation, we can see the 3-button is again translucent here, and then there's also this input bar that is now hidden behind the 3-button navigation. And this happened after targeting Android 15, and it's because this custom composable is not handling insets. So this is the second issue we'll fix. All right, back to fixing the first issue, we're going to go over to our main activity and remove the translucent 3-button navigation. Okay, I have set window is navigation bar contrast enforced to false. This API only impacts 3-gesture navigation. It does not impact, it only impacts 3-button navigation. It does not impact gesture navigation. And by setting it to false, I remove the translucency, so now it is transparent. You might think that this background here is now just colored to be brown, like the app bar here. But that's not the case. It is instead transparent. And what we're seeing instead is the app's navigation bar background drawing all the way down to the bottom. So this brings us to our second issue that we're going to fix. You might be wondering why on this screen the app's navigation bar is not hidden behind the 3-button navigation bar, but on one of the conversation screens, our custom input bar is all of a sudden hiding behind the 3-button navigation bar. And that's because on the previous screen, this is a Material 3 composable along with the app bar here. And Material 3 composables automatically handle insets for us, so a lot of this work is taken care of for us. But our custom composables, like this input bar here, do not automatically handle insets for us. So let's go ahead and handle insets to fix this second issue. This input bar you can find under UI, chat, and chat screen. It is defined around line 415. We can see that it takes content padding, and then it applies this content padding to the row composable, where this composable contains all the buttons here. Right now, content padding is set to 0 dp, so the only padding that's being applied is this 16 dp, so you're just seeing 16 dp padding here. And we can see that 0 is being passed in here if we go to where input bar is called at line 214. So here we're passing in 0 to simulate that we're not handling insets. So I'm going to go ahead and handle insets and then explain the code change. All right. I have set inner padding. I've made a copy of the inner padding and set the top to 0 dp. What am I doing here? Let's walk through this code real quick. So input bar is located within a scaffold. If you are familiar with scaffold, you know that scaffold contains padding values, which we are calling here inner padding. Padding values allows you to set padding on your content to ensure that content is not hidden behind the system bars or between other elements in the scaffold, like the top app bar or a app navigation bar. In this case, for our custom input bar, we want to handle insets at the bottom and at the left and right-hand edges, but we do not need to account for the status bar or for the top app bar. So for that reason, we're making a copy of the padding values or the copy of inner padding and setting the top to 0 dp, which we've done on this line here. Okay, so copy is actually an internal method for SociaLite. You might want to create something similar for your app. It does what it says. It takes a copy of padding values and uses the existing padding values for start, end, and bottom. But since we've supplied a different top padding value of 0 dp, it will use that instead of the existing top padding. And SociaLite has already finished building and running, and we see that now insets are properly handled. This input bar is no longer being hidden by the 3-button navigation. And this is the case if you rotate your phone as well, because edge to edge is not just drawing from top to bottom, it's also left to right. So you'll want to consider what your phone looks like in landscape mode. You can see that the send arrow here is not all the way over to the right. It's taking into account the 3 buttons, which are now on the right-hand side. So if there is one takeaway from this edge-to-edge code lab, this is it. There's a good chance that somewhere in your app there's going to be a button or a custom view or a composable that's not handling insets, and you'll need to handle insets. You'll want to consider handling insets at the top of the screen, at the bottom of the screen, on the left-hand edges, and the right-hand edges. So we don't have time to go over this section in the code lab for this workshop, but I do want to point it out. Section 5 of the code lab is optional additional edge-to-edge considerations for your app. So these are considerations that don't necessarily apply to SociaLite, but they might apply to your app. So please give this a look to see if anything is relevant to you. It talks about what to do if you're using Material 3 components, Material 2 components, views. What if you have scrolling content? How to handle the display cutout or the camera cutout, and some code samples for that, in addition to testing things like caption bars. Okay, but back to the code lab. So we have now made SociaLite compatible with the Android 15 edge-to-edge enforcements. There is now just one more line of code that we need to make SociaLite backwards compatible in an edge-to-edge way. And we want to do this because, again, users prefer edge-to-edge screens. So for that, we're going to go to main activity, and we're going to call enable edge-to-edge. Enable edge-to-edge comes from Android X activity. This is one line of code that encapsulates the 100 lines of code you previously needed to make your app edge-to-edge in a backwards compatible way. So you no longer need that 100 lines of code, you just need this one enable edge-to-edge line of code. All right, and with that, we have finished the first edge-to-edge code lab, and we are going to move on to the predictive code lab. So 1 out of 3 code labs, done. Thank you. All right, so for the Predictive Back code lab, we already have the code downloaded. We are, again, using SociaLite. If you open up the Predictive Back code lab, which is in that pathway, you're going to, again, meet me in step 3. For Predictive Back, you're going to need gesture navigation enabled. And then it's easier to see the Predictive Back animations in Lighttheme, so we'll use Lighttheme. Let's look at what SociaLite looks like without Predictive Back animations. So if I swipe back here, we can see an animation is not playing. You can tell I'm swiping back because you see the back arrow. As soon as I lift my finger, then an animation plays. In contrast, in addition, if I go to one of the conversation screens, say sheep, and I swipe back, an animation does not play until I lift my finger, and then Navigation Compose's default crossfade animation plays. So Predictive Back is all about playing animations while you swipe back. We're going to add 2 Predictive Back animations to this app and then customize one of those animations. So for that, we're going to go to our Android manifest and add Android, enable onBack invoke callback, and set that equal to true. Okay, so now when I swipe back, I see a preview of where I'm going before I swipe back, which allows me to cancel if I need to potentially prevent me from accidentally leaving my app. This animation here is called the back to home animation. It is not new. It has been available since Android 13, but what is new is that it is no longer behind a developer option starting today. So yeah, If you are on an Android 15 Beta 1 test device like I am, you can still test the back to home animation. You'll just need to go into your developer options and enable the Predictive Back Animations developer option. So this option controls 3 animations. It's back to home, cross activity, and cross task. It does not control the navigation, compose, crossfade animation. And this is the option here that is being removed starting today in Android 15 Beta 2. Okay, so let's look at that second animation. Now if I swipe back from this chat screen, I can see a crossfade animation slowly play out if I slowly swipe back. So that's, again, Navigation Compose's default animation. All we had to do was add Android enable on back invoke callback equal to true. And then in the code lab, it also asks you to update a library dependency, which I did ahead of time to save time. So you'll also need to update your navigation compose dependency to 2.8.0 alpha 02 or higher. So this is the second animation that we're going to customize. I think it looks pretty good, but we can make it look better. So for that, we are going to go to chat screen. Nope. We are going to go to main, because that's where our nav host is, and we're going to add a few animations into the nav host. Okay, so I've added 2 animations in here. Let's walk through this. I've added a pop exit transition and a pop enter transition. I could have also specified exit transition and enter transition. Those would have played if the pop variants weren't specified. So what this does, focusing on the pop enter transition first, this is the transition for this sheep's conversation as it transitions out. It will scale out and fade out quickly, and then it will fully fade out before the entering chats animation scales in and fades in after a slight delay. So if we swipe back slowly, it kind of looks like this. This exits quickly, the chat screen comes in, and then if we swipe back quickly, it looks like that. We recommend to use this transition for your full screen surfaces that are not shared element transitions, both with Compose and for fragments. So with that, we've done all the coding portions of the Predictive Back code lab. We're now going to talk about some additional considerations that, again, don't apply to SociaLite, but may apply to your app. The first one is around this back to home animation here. It is very easy to accidentally disable this back to home animation if you intercept back at your main activity. So for that reason, we recommend that you do not intercept back in your main activity or in your root activity, because then you'll disable the system back to home animation. I'm going to pop over to the Predictive Back code lab to look at, to show some APIs for the other considerations. Okay, so for this code lab, we've been talking a lot about Compose. SociaLite is built fully in Compose, but Predictive Back is also supported with fragments, including shared element transitions. So you'll use one of these existing fragment APIs, like set custom animations or set shared element enter transition. And then if you are using these APIs, be sure to use Animator and Android X transitions, or one of the material motions like material shared axis, material fade through, or material fade. Do not use animation or framework transitions. So again, animation and framework transitions don't work with Predictive Back, but Animator and Android X transitions and most material motions do. And another note on fragments, there are no default cross-fragment transitions like we have with Compose. So for those transitions, you'll need to code them in yourself using one of these APIs. Also, we have support for both material view components and a handful of material compose components. And finally, last but not least, we have support for shared element transitions in Compose. Okay, so that wraps up the Predictive Back code lab. And with that, I will hand it off to Summers to talk about Glance.
All right, let's create a widget using Glance for SociaLite. So like the edge-to-edge and Predictive Back code labs, we are still in Android Studio. We're still on Android 15, though this code lab can actually be done with Android 12 or higher. There are a few extra things that you should be aware of, though you won't necessarily need. Among them are basic HILT knowledge. We're not going to be using HILT directly, but several of the objects that we interact with are instantiated and accessed using HILT. All right, so let's begin. This is the widget we are going to add to SociaLite. It is a favorite contact widget where you can put a picture of your favorite contact on the screen. Additionally, this widget will tell you whether or not you have a new message. So, like before, you can get the code for this code lab from our GitHub repository. If you've already done the edge-to-edge and predictive back code labs, the widget code lab will build on top of them as well. So let's get started actually adding a widget. A widget is a part of your application that lives inside of an app widget host. Normally this is a home screen, though it's not required to be one. Certain information screens and the Android Assistant will also be able to display widgets. Jetpack Glance is Google's new recommended way for writing new widgets. It is in release candidate 1 right now, and will be released for a final version soon. The way that widgets are created is by implementing an app widget provider and a remote view with some widget information, and then setting them up in your Android manifest as a receiver element. This receiver should be exported. It should handle the android.appwidget.action, appwidget update, action intent. And also, you should pass the app widget provider info file in as a metadata element with the Android app widget provider name and a reference to the widget. All right, so how do we get Glance in our project? Well, the first thing we want to do is make sure that we've added Glance to our libs.versions.toml file. This is the version catalog in a Gradle project. In this particular instance, we're using the release candidate. We will also be updating the code lab to reference the release candidate. Then you reference the Glance app widget and Glance material 3 modules in your version catalog or build.gradle file. And then you can add them to your build.gradle file as dependencies. Scrolling, keep scrolling. And you can add them in your build.gradle file as dependencies. All right. If you're just adding this to your file, this will be where you resynchronize your project. All right. So widgets are written in remote views. And when you use Glance, you can extend the Glance app widget class to create these remote views using a compose style API using Glance composables. And your app widget provider, instead, you extend the Glance app widget receiver class. So let's add those to our project now. If you open the SociaLite app widget file, this is an implementation of the Glance app widget class, and it calls this provide glance, and it overrides this provide glance method. So for our first widget, we just want to add a simple hello world message, and we can do that by using the Glance composable text. Then hello world. We need to import this composable, and we want to make sure that we use the AndroidX.glance composable and not the AndroidX compose material 3 composable. Glance composables and Jetpack composables are not mutually creative. Additionally, you want to make sure that you provide this content in the provide content method. So to repeat that, to implement a widget using Glance, you want to extend the Glance app widget class, you want to override the provide glance method, and you want to provide your composables using the provide content method in your widget. Next, you will want to implement the Glance app widget receiver class. Oh, no. And we have that implementation stubbed out as the SociaLite app widget receiver in our code lab. The SociaLite app widget the Glance app widget receiver implementations have this property that you need to override called Glance app widget receiver. And normally this should just be a no arguments invocation of your app widget. In our case, this will be the SociaLite app widget. All right. So we've implemented our Glance app widget. We've implemented our Glance app widget receiver. The next thing we want to do is create our app widget provider information XML file. And we can do that by going into our XML resources folder and adding a new XML resource file. We'll name this SociaLite app widget, or SociaLite widget info. We will set our root element to app widget provider, and then we will create it. All right, so let's switch back to the code lab real quick. The app widget provider information is a file that tells the Android operating system and your app widget host information about your widget. It tells you whether or not the widget's resizable, how large it can be resized to, what its minimum size is, whether or not there's a configuration activity, what features your widget supports. In this case, we're saying that you don't require configuration to add your widget to your home screen, and that the widget can be reconfigured after you add it. We add a preview image to our app widget picker, and then we also set an initial layout. In this case, this is a layout that is provided by the Glance library. All right. And then the last step that we want to do is associate all of these guys together in our Android manifest XML file. And like I said before, we create a receiver. We make it the SociaLite app widget receiver. We want to make sure that this receiver is exported. And we want to give it a label. Since this is our favorite contact widget, we'll use the favorite contact label. Then we want to implement the intent filters. And we want to add a action, name, android.appwidget.action.appwidget update. And then we also want to associate we want to add a metadata element that associates the app widget info file. So metadata, name, android.appwidget.provider, and then resource at xml/SociaLite widget info. All right, and we'll just double check that with our code lab. That looks good. And now when we rerun our SociaLite application, we should see in our widget picker that we have the SociaLite widget available. Ah, there it is. All right, we have added our Hello World widget to our screen. You might notice a few things. One of the things is that it doesn't match our preview image. We'll update it in a moment. And also, it doesn't really seem to have a lot of the things we say a good widget should have. It doesn't have a well-defined shape. It's kind of hard to read. It's not really jiving with our background theme. So the next thing we want to do is we want to improve the design of our widget. So when we're thinking about the design of our widget, we want to think of something that keeps the content fresh. We want to think about something that minimizes the awkward resizing layouts. And we also want it to pick up the colors from other widgets in the host background. Glance provides several composables that make this really easy. Let's start by adding a scaffold composable to our Glance app widget. The scaffold composable is provided by the Glance library, and it's a simple API for displaying the widget UI. It includes a title bar, and it also has some basic padding for its body. And it also sets the default color to your widget background theme. All right, so let's go back to the SociaLite app widget and add the following code. And then we fix our imports. Oops. Okay, so what we've done is we've done a small refactor. We've moved our our widget composable out of provide content into its own composable function. We've wrapped it in the glance theme composable, which allows our widget to pick up the themes that are provided from glance. And then we've added the scaffold. We've given it a title bar. We've given the title bar a icon and a title, SociaLite. And also we've moved our Hello World text composable into the body of the app widget. So when we relaunch the application and re-add the widget to our home screen, we should see these updated design elements appear. All right, good. This is a great first step. So we see that the widget now has a background, and it's picking up our widget theme from other colors. Now let's switch it over to dark mode, and the widget automatically adapts to that, but we see that our text style is not quite right. We can fix this by adding a text style to our text composable. And then we give it a color, and we will get from our glance theme the on-surface color token. And now we rerun the application, and we replace our widget. And now in dark mode, our color of our text composable is much more legible than it was before. Let's go back to our code lab. So this is all part of dynamic color, where your app widget picks up hints of the color from the surrounding environment in your home screen launcher, the background, and it makes sure that your app widget matches the themes of your app icons as well as your other widgets. All right. So now that we've improved the design, let's talk a little bit about the state of our application and how we're going to get the users to select their favorite contact from it. What we want to think about is when a user adds a widget to their home screen that requires configuration, we need to add a zero state. This is a state that should prompt users to do some sort of configuration action. And then once this action is done, the widget should update itself to show its final layout. And we're going to do that now. In the code lab, I go into a lot more detail about how this data is stored and how it's processed. But what you really need to know for this demonstration is that we're going to use this widget model, and we're going to use a widget model repository class. The widget model repository class is a class that's managed with Hilt, and we're going to use a Hilt getter to get that. So let's add the zero state to our widget, and let's also add the repository to our provide glance method. So going back to our code. All right, and cleaning up our imports. And moving this down here. All right, so when provide glance is called, it's provided a widget ID, and we need to unwrap the glance ID and make it a widget ID. And then we're going to get a reference to our widget model repository, which lets us update and receive updates from our widget data. Then we're going to update our content repository so that we can pass the widget repository in, our content composable, so that we can pass the widget repository in. And then we fix the imports. All right, so now we load the model from our repository, and we're going to replace our content method with this when block. This when block will switch on whether we have a loading state or if we have an actual widget model. And we're going to use a zero-state composable that is provided by the code lab. So now and then we need to fix this one last thing, repository, widget ID. All right, so now when our widget is loaded, it will get a reference to our repository, load the model for the widget, and if the model is not available, display a zero state. And if the model is available, we'll go back to displaying our hello world code. So let's relaunch our application. Replace our widget. All right, and now we're seeing our zero state. So if we choose the option to select our favorite contact, it brings up our configuration activity. And then when we select our contact, nothing happens. We haven't actually added the ability we haven't actually updated our repository from our configuration activity. So let's open the SociaLite app widget configuration activity. And in the contact row, on click handler, we're going to do several things. First, we are going to launch a new coroutine. We're going to call create or update in our widget model repository with our new widget model. This has the app widget ID, the contact's ID, the contact's name, the contact's icon, and false to say that they have no unread messages. Then we're going to call SociaLite app widget update all, which will update all instances of the app widget on our home screen. And finally, we're going to set the state of the configuration activity so that the Android operating system knows that the widget was configured. And we will fix our imports. And we will rerun our application. And now, when we select our favorite contact, the widget sees that the widget model in the background has updated, and we have our state update from the please select your favorite contact to the hello world. And the last thing we want to do is we want to go back to our SociaLite app widget, and we want to replace this text composable with our favorite contact composable. And that fix our imports. I will cheat. And now, when we rerun our application for the last time, oh, there is an error. And now when we rerun our application for the last time, when we select our favorite contact, our widget updates. And so now that we have a widget model saved in the database and our widget updates, the glance composable recomposes the widget, and it shows our widget with its new default state. And if we go to the SociaLite app and we go to the dog and we send it a message, when the dog responds in a few seconds, we'll see that our widget states updates to say that we have a message. See that our widget state updates to say that we have a message. There it goes. All right. So, and now when we click on the widget, we read our message, and the widget updates to say that there are no new messages. In the code lab, we also do cover maintaining and updating your data to keep your state in sync, as well as to clean up any data that happens to get orphaned when you close the dog, or when you remove the widget. All right. And with that, we've added a widget to SociaLite, we've added edge-to-edge design, and we've added a predictive back animation. Ash, would you like to come up and help us close out?
Thank you so much, all. Yeah, as Summer said, we've added edge-to-edge, predictive back, and glance to SociaLite. Now SociaLite is looking much more premium and satisfying than it did before. We hope that you can take these learnings back to your application. Thank you all again very much.